So welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And welcome to today's virtual reading group. We are continuing to read the Jewish writings edited by Jerome Cohn and Ron Feldman. This is a big book. We're now, I guess, more than halfway through it. A lot of these writings that we've been reading are from very early on, right? Arendt in Paris, Arendt in New York, Arendt during the war, and this is still during the war. This is an essay, The Jewish Pariah, a Hidden Tradition, published in 1944. It was published in, and this is a little different than most of the other things we've read so far in this book. It wasn't published in Aufbau or a small journal like Menorah. It's published in Jewish Social Research, which is, I don't know the journal per se, but an academic journal, or Jewish Social Studies in 1944. So it's one of the first things we're reading in this book that is written for at least somewhat of an academic audience. And thus the tone changes a little bit. It's also a text that has an afterlife in a lot of Arendt's work. There are parts of it that will be brought back in the chapter 3, I believe, in The Origins of Totalitarianism. And I think you can see many echoes of it in the essay on Humanity in Dark Times on Lessing, in the book Men in Dark Times, which we've read and talked about, and is one of her great essays. And by the way, will be the sort of foundation for our thinking about our next conference coming up in October 12th and 13th of 2023. It's not yet announced, so you get the pre-announcement, which is going to be on friendship. And the Lessing essay is very much an essay on friendship. And so we will be talking more about that. Probably sometime in the next 6 to 8 months, we'll read that essay again, just as a way to prepare ourselves for the conference. This essay, The Jewish Pariah, a Hidden Tradition, also, I should say, give the name to a book called The Jewish Pariah, which Ron Feldman edited. It was actually one of the first books of Arendt's I ever found and read many moons ago, back as an undergraduate. And it is, I think, one of her really insightful and provocative essays on questions of oppression, politics, how one lives as an oppressed people. And that's really what the essay is about. How Jews, that's the question she's asking, but I think in her work, she makes an effort. We can talk about whether it's a justified effort or not. She makes an effort to analogize from how Jews lived as an oppressed and pariah people to how other pariah and oppressed peoples can live or should live in such a circumstance. And whether that analogy works and whether that transition works is actually an important question. She begins the essay by saying Jews don't claim their status in arts and letters, right? There are a lot of famous Jewish writers, poets, musicians, and they don't say, I'm a Jewish poet or I'm a Jewish musician. They largely, go by, whatever it is, German or French or whatever other nationality they have. And they allow credit to go to other peoples. They hide. And she says this hiding of the Jews, right, means that the people who fare the worst are those bold spirits, those Jewish bold spirits, who try to make Jewish emancipation actually mean something, namely, and then she says this on 275 at the bottom, that emancipation would actually mean an admission of the Jews as Jews to the ranks of humanity. Right? That's, this is like one of those lines that we should all like bold or put over our, you could replace it with anything. Jews as Jews to the ranks of humanity, right? Muslims as Muslims to the ranks of humanity. Blacks as Blacks in America to the ranks of humanity. Women as women to the ranks of humanity. What does it mean, right? That's in a sense, this is in a sense Arendt's thesis or clarion call here. And to go back to a theme that's going to come up again here, but we've talked a lot about over the last month or so, the problem with assimilation is that assimilation requires that to enter into freedom, a free political society, you have to deny who you are. You have to not, you have to, as a Jew, you have to stop wearing certain kinds of clothes and fit in. You have to stop obeying the Sabbath and obey the Sabbath of the rest of the country. You have to try and become part of an indifferent mass. And so assimilation requires that you, for the ticket of becoming a human, you have to not be who you are, a Jew. And this is her claim that in a world in which Jews assimilate and in a world in which Jews hide who they are, the people who fare the worst are the ones who would want to be human and remain as Jews. She then transitions and says, all right, Jews are not only oppressed, they're what Max Weber called pariahs, pariah peoples. And what is a pariah? It's a social outcast. Assimilation holds out the promise of equality, she says on 276. But that promise is treacherous because in order to be equal, you have to give up something, namely who you are. And if you keep to who you are, you're an outcast. And it's worse than that, because even if you try and assimilate and you try and give up who you are, they will continue to say you're a Jew, or you're a woman, or you're Black, or you're a Muslim, or whatever it is, and you will never attain the full human status. And so she says, in reaction to that, Jewish writers developed the concept of the pariah as a type. What does that mean? It means that they develop themselves as a pariah, which is what they were anyway, that would give them a certain freedom, that would give them a certain credibility or a certain power, if you like. And that these types of pariahs become ways for Jews to exist as pariahs and yet also make their lives more meaningful and more human in some way. And she says there are 4 types of pariah that she's going to talk about. There's more than that. She says she's going to talk about 4. And they're personified by 4 different Jewish artists. Heinrich Heine, who talks about the Schlemiel and the Lord of Dreams. Charlie Chaplin, who talks about the Suspect. Bernard Lazare, the conscious pariah, and Kafka, the man of goodwill. And she then asks the question of what in fact unites all 4 of these types. Okay, so clearly the 2 of these types that she spends the most time on are Heine and Kafka, and then also Lazare. And I should just say that Heine, Kafka, and Lazare come back and play roles in her thinking over the next 25 years. They become types that remain deeply influential in her thinking about these issues. Interestingly enough, Chaplin is the one that doesn't so much. I mean, I don't want to I mean, I don't know. I'm sure she mentions him again, but not often. And I think that's an interesting something to notice, because it just shows some of her biases and prejudices, and we'll get there in a second. The Hannah's idea of the pariah is the Shlemiel, or the Lord of Dreams. Now, some of you I know probably know Yiddish better than I do. Some of you probably don't. A Shlemiel, if you look it up, is defined as oafish or klutzy or dreamy, a loser or fool. You know, we used to call a Shlemiel as someone who, you know, a friend of ours who's a good person, but every couple days they come to you and says, oh my God, you know, I lost my phone, or, oh my God, this happened, or, oh my God. And it's never their fault, right? They're always innocent. But it just seems like bad luck seems to cling to them all the time. And, you know, I didn't know this until I had read this essay, but it comes from a character, a person in the Bible, in the book of Numbers, Shelumiel ben Zershadeh, who got himself killed accidentally when Zimri was beheaded. So this is, I think, an example, right? They go to behead someone else, and this poor Shlemiel happened to be standing in the path of the sword. They got beheaded together, and that's sort of the exemplification of what a Shlemiel is: someone who's innocent, and yet just seems to always attract terrible, bad things. Hannah, who was a Jew, and did allow himself to become a German. I think he was baptized, if I'm not mistaken. Nevertheless, remained a Jewish writer, and he's someone for whom he embraced both his Jewishness and thus his exclusion from society, but also wanted to be part of society, to assimilate. And the attitude he took, Arendt says, is the one of a Shlemiel, or the Lord of Dreams. And that means that he sort of saw the pariah status that was given to Jews as a kind of anti-social world. The social world was artificial. It was full of hypocrisy. It was full of people who were, you know, evil and cunning and full of intrigue in the courts. And the Jews, the pariahs, were more this common people. In a sense, the Jews were the children to the world of adults. And she says that there was a kind of joie de vivre of childhood in Hannah's writing. That there was an embrace of the simple equality of the sun, namely that the sun shines on everyone equally, even if you're poor and oppressed. And thus all inequality is ridiculous. The artificial society is comic. The parvenu, the one who seeks to succeed as an assimilated person, is comic. And Hannah, like these kind of pariahs, find a kind of freedom in being aloof from the world of society, in standing apart from society and not protesting against society and trying to change it and get your rights, but in simply standing aloof from it. We deny the reality of society, and we say that our reality as pariahs, as Shlemiels, is more real than the social reality, than the reality of the oppressors. We are more human. We are more real as these people who have common values. And that's what she means by the Lord of Dreams, right? That we find the dream world of our pariahdom more real than the world of society. And we find a kind of amused indifference to that world and a natural freedom in our world. There's a kind of danger in this approach, or, you know, not a kind of danger. There is a danger in this approach of what Arendt would call worldlessness. And she talks about that a lot in the Lessing essay that I mentioned early on humanity in dark times. What saves Hannah from this worldlessness, this sort of, you know, in a sense, embrace of the shadow world as against the real world, is his creativity. His creativity is what keeps him honest to the world. Namely, he's not ideological. He doesn't simply elevate the shadow world, doesn't simply elevate the world of dreams. He holds a mirror to both and is able to, as a result, not become dogmatic and to see the world of society in all of its glory, but also in all of its foibles and all of its awfulness, but also to see the beauty of the world of nature, the world of the pariahs, but also its limitations. And that's why she says he was one of these rare souls. She says he's the only German Jew who is both Jew and German. He's the only happy assimilated Jew because he's able to live both in the world of shadows as a pariah and also as a German in the world of society. He was in a position, she says, to do what few others could do: speak the language of a free man, become a citizen, become a German, and sing the songs of a natural one, enjoy the happiness and aloofness and carefree nature of being a pariah, to be both a free German and a natural Jew. And so that's one type of being a pariah, one approach to embracing pariahdom. I mean, the success that Hannah has in it is not open to most because very few people can achieve what he achieved. But what most people will do is just sort of embrace the schlemiel, embrace the dream, and embrace the sort of joy of being in an intimate relationship with other oppressed people. And in that relationship, find a kind of joy in being together, poor, singing songs, enjoying nature, etc. She really does talk about this in the Lessing essay, and talks about how there's a kind of there can be a kind of temptation of pariah peoples to want to just live in the darkness, to live outside of society and say we're better than them. And it's sort of like people, the idea of you sing songs, you take care of each other, you protect each other, and you sort of say we're better than society. And she warns against that in the Lessing essay. But it is one type of being a pariah and finding a kind of freedom and joy in that. The second type she talks about is Bernard Lazare, the conscious pariah. And this comes back a lot in her work. Arendt calls herself a conscious pariah. The conscious pariah rebels against oppression, whereas the oppressors or the dominant forces in a society uses allies from the oppressed groups and rewards them with special privileges in order to keep them in line. The conscious pariah rebels and sees themselves always as an outsider, as a pariah, and they fight for their rights. You can see this in Arendt's call for a Jewish army. You can see it in her claim against assimilation and against the parvenu. She, as an intellectual, calls herself a conscious pariah, one who stands apart from society, embraces the fact that her Jewishness allows her to stand apart from society so that she can look at society with more impartial eyes. It's one of the reasons she thinks she's able to see truths in society that other people can't, because she embraces the fact that she's an outsider. The third is Charlie Chaplin, which she calls the suspect. The basic idea here is that as a suspect, Chaplin must bear the brunt of much that he has not done. He's afraid of cops. Cops arrest him and other Jews and bother them, often for things they haven't done. And that causes a kind of burden, right? And we see this today in the Black Lives Matter movement, and the idea that if you're constantly being accused of and suspected of things you haven't done, there's a burden that goes along with it. At the same time, Chaplin shows that if you're always suspect, and you use your wits in some way, you can get away with a lot. If you're always being suspected of things, you're not watched as closely in some other ways, and there's a lot you can do, and you can lead to a lot of fun and things. And it can lead to both fear of the cops, but also impudence, of feeling like you can get away with things. And so she says Charlie Chaplin offers that path to pariah people, to sort of enjoy being an outsider. Yeah, you comes with the burden of being a suspect, but you can also, you're a little bit outside the rules, a little bit outside the norms, and you can push the norms and embrace that attitude. The fourth approach to being a pariah is Franz Kafka, the man of goodwill. Kafka says that there's two paths to finding, or Arendt says there's two paths to finding a kind of real existence that have been open to pariahs. One is the society of Bohemians, sort of stepping out of society, conscious pariah, the dream world of dreams, etc. And the other has been to embrace a kind of world of beauty and nature and art. But we've entered a time in which nature has become, and art have become, man-made, and art and nature are now socialized. And so there's less and less room for the pariah. How does the pariah stand outside of society when even society now controls nature and controls art? And Kafka's answer to that is through thinking, that thinking becomes the new weapon for the pariah to defend oneself. And in this case, Arendt reads two of his stories to show this. The basic, there's a lot here, and I realize I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to see what I can do to bring this to a close. But the basic idea here is that what Kafka says is that in The Castle, which is the better known and the last story, that if you are a member of the castle, namely of the oppressors or the dominant group in a society, and yet you're a Jew and not fully a member, what are your options, right? You can assimilate to the castle and lose who you are, right? You can try and go back to the village, to the common people, and yet you can never really go back. You can't, because you're always going to be seen as someone from the castle. Or you can try and live in this in-between world. And that's what that's the position that she thinks so many assimilated Jews get caught in. Kay in the novel seeks to renounce his distinctive Jewish traits, to become a universalist, someone who simply a typical man of goodwill. And as a typical man of goodwill, he thinks he deserves his rights, his human rights, his right to work, his right to earn a living, his right to get married, his right to have kids, his right to live a normal life. And he thinks, why can't I have it? And why can't all the villagers have it? And the villagers say to him, you're crazy, right? The people understand that the way to get ahead is not by simply claiming your rights, but by seeking connections and privileges with the people in the castle. They understand that the way to move ahead is by cozying up to power and getting individual privileges, to be an exceptional Jew, to use the term. And that they understand that we're always fated to be at the mercy of the people in the castle, the Gentiles. We can put this into racial categories or gender categories in the United States as well. What they understand is that the basic rights don't depend on you as a Jew or as a human, but on privileges coming from above. You always need the gift from above. And Kay has to, in the end, reconcile himself to the reality that he has to, in a sense, share this misery and distress of the villagers, and understand that he can't have it his way. He can't just have the right to be a person of goodwill with normal rights. And so he seems to have failed. And yet Arendt says, not really, because in fighting for the right to be normal, in fighting for the right to be an average, normal citizen who has rights, he showed the people that they had a right to be normal, and that they should fight for it themselves. And they say, how lucky we are that you came to us. She tells this story of Max Brod, who was Kafka's friend and editor, who relates in an epilogue to the novel The Castle, with what enthusiasm Kafka repeated to him the story of how Flaubert, this is on page 295, how Flaubert, returning from a visit to a simple, happy family of many children, had exclaimed spontaneously, I'll say it in English, those folks are right. Men have a right to live normal, not exceptional lives. The end of this then turns to a fascinating question, which is to say that it's this realization that men have a right to live normal, not exceptional life, that turned Kafka into a Zionist. Because if you are a Jew and you have a right to live a normal life, it may be that you have to live in a Jewish state. Because if it turns out that you're always a second-class citizen in a non-Jewish state, is there a way to live a normal life in a Gentile state, in a state of non-Jews? She says that Kafka was never a nationalist. He was a humanist, and Zionism was not something that came easily to him. You can hear her thinking for herself here, right? I, Hannah Arendt, am not a nationalist. I'm a humanist. I believe that everyone should have the right to live a normal life. And I don't believe that it should be just Germans or Jews, but I understand the world, right? I have seen the world, and the world is such that we can only live as human beings when we're in a people, and we're in a nation state or a people, we're in a state where we have the ability and the right to appear and speak in public and be taken seriously. And if we Jews don't have that right, it may be we need a Jewish state. And that's how she ends this essay. All right. Remind everybody here, please keep the chat civil. I think there have been some issues in the last week or two, and I want people to really do make an effort to be civil and respectful to each other. It doesn't mean you can't disagree, but keep the tone on a higher level. In the chat, I don't have a chance while I'm doing this to constantly check the chat, so please keep that on the up and up if we can. I will take questions here, and I look forward to a conversation. I love this essay. I think it's psychologically a great essay, and I think it's a really important essay for a lot of issues today. So I look forward to the conversation. Adolf, you're up first.
Well, I wanted to say that I really appreciated her theory of the pariah. I guess maybe I'm saying theory of the pariah, but what I understood to be how she theorized the pariah. And I think it's very useful in the sense where I think if you read Marx and the whole idea of the working class, I think that it seems like the way that I read it was that she proposes that the pariah produces a culture, or the pariah can produce a culture, or the pariah has avenues and that kind of thing. But is it something that you agree with, that the pariah has avenues? Or do you think that like a lot of other folks, that like the pariah has no real agency, or the pariah, there has to be some kind of like emancipation of the pariah?
Well, you start off with the hardest question. Thank you. You're going to push us right into the heart of things. I think this is one of most challenging questions you can ask. This is the question that Arendt wrote to James Baldwin about, for those of you who know that little letter, when she read The Fire Next Time, or the essay that would be part of The Fire Next Time in the New Yorker, and said how much she liked it and how much it impacted her, but in a way that many people found arrogant, criticized him for bringing love into politics, and said that attempt to bring love into politics is a mistake. I take that, I'm reading that in a similar way to Adolf's question about, is there a way for pariah people to develop their own culture and their own selves? Because to the extent a pariah people does that, right, they can develop an incredibly rich artistic, cultural world, a world of love, of feeling, of joy, of beauty. But the more they live in that pariah world, the more they abandon the political world, the world of power. And she calls it sort of the temptation of the pariah, right? It's the temptation of the pariah to embrace that kind of intimacy of other oppressed peoples and see the oppression as a kind of shadow world in the Hannah sense, in the Heinrich Heine sense, and a kind of fraternity of the oppressed, an embrace of compassion. And so she really, she understands how beautiful that can be. But part of what she's talking about in her critique of Heine, or in her critique that Heine was one of these truly very few exceptional people who could do both, is that to embrace that world of a pariah as a schlemiel, as a lord of dreams, is to, in a sense, abandon the world of politics and the world of power. And now I remember that I forgot actually how I was going to end the introduction. So I'm going to come back to that on page 296, right? This is absolutely essential to Adolf's question. She says, so long as the Jews of Western Europe were pariahs only in a social sense, right? Here we get the classic Arendtian distinction between social and political, right? As long as the Jews of Western Europe were pariahs only in a social sense, they could find salvation to some extent, or to a large extent, she writes, by becoming parvenus. They could assimilate to some degree. They could become successful Jews, writers, lawyers, doctors, whatever. And even though their positions were insecure because they were still Jews, they could achieve a modus vivendi, and what she calls a combination of an inner slavery with an outward freedom. They could live as citizens and be outwardly free, but again, under the inner slavery of having to give up in their lives being Jews. And that trade-off could be worth it, because you could have a certain freedom. You could have outward freedom and inner slavery, but even in the inside, you could sometimes retreat to the world of dreams and the world of joy. And as Adolf was saying, build a culture of being a pariah people. And so even though they were excluded from the world of political realities, they could still retreat into their quiet corners and preserve the illusion of liberty and unchallenged humanity. She's writing in 1944. She says, no longer, right? In 1944, that idea of living as a pariah and building a pariah culture is just been shown to be an absolute meaningless sham, because the bottom, she says, has dropped out. The pariah Jew and the parvenu Jew are in the same boat, rowing desperately in the same angry sea away from Germany. And not just Germany, right? Both are branded with the same mark, Jew, thus outlaws. And today the truth has come home. There is no protection in heaven or earth against bare murder. And a man can be driven at any moment from the streets and broad places once open to all. So the outward freedom that the pariah Jew can find in being a social pariah disappears once you end up with a Nazi society or a Jim Crow society or a Bolshevik society or whatever it is. And she says, and here's, I think, the really important line: at long last, it has become clear that the senseless freedom of the individual, namely social pariah, the freedom one gets as a social pariah, merely paves the way for the senseless suffering of his entire people. And this is a point that she comes back to in chapter 3 of Origins of Totalitarianism and struggles with in that chapter. In that chapter, she's going to say there's a difference between being a social discrimination and political discrimination. And while social discrimination is uncomfortable and at times difficult, it's not dangerous, whereas political discrimination is dangerous. The problem is, as she talks about here and there, is to what extent does social discrimination pave the way for political discrimination? And writing in 1944, she's pretty clear that it does. Writing in 1950 in the Origins, she's less clear. Writing in the 1950s in things like Little Rock, I think she's even less clear. And I think that's an enormous question that we all have to ask ourselves as we consider Arendt's thinking on these issues. To what extent can you make a meaningful distinction between social discrimination and political discrimination, right? There's probably more to be said, but Adolf, do you want to follow up on any of that? Or because I mean, I think it's a really important question. So I want to give you a chance to come back at it.
I think that what you said was perfect. I mean, I think that I didn't necessarily put all of that into it, but when I think of emancipatory politics or politics that are emancipatory, when I think of social discrimination and political discrimination, I think about like the willingness to do something about social and political discrimination. And I really think about this word pariah, and if there may be something about the pariah. I'm not thinking about something metaphysical or something like, I'm using this big word, but ontological or something, but perhaps like sometimes like there's something about the pariah sometimes that makes a person unwilling to even seek emancipation.
Yeah.
And it's almost like sometimes I ask myself, like, must you even leave the identity pariah to even seek emancipation?
I see. Yeah. So, I mean, that's great. I mean, so the conscious pariah, I think that's clear on, right? The conscious pariah says we have to embrace our pariah nature but most people who are pariahs sort of try and hide it. They don't want to admit it. And they sort of live as pariahs without really knowing it. And they try and make it as comfortable as they can. Whereas the conscious pariah rebels against it. Kafka says, in order to fight, you have to be willing to insist that living a normal life is a human right, which includes being both a Jew and a citizen. And most Jews, she says, will either choose assimilation and therefore give up being a Jew in order to be a citizen, or choose pariahdom and give up political rights in order to feel comfortable as a Jew. And you know, these are the traps of being both a parvenu or a pariah. That she structures this question around assimilation on. And I think for so many groups in our society who are, you know, trying to figure out their own ways around questions of assimilation and not, this way of thinking is quite powerful. I think that's certainly my experience. Well, I hope to come back. You know, if other people have questions about this, let's come back to it because it's important. Gilbert, you're next.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. So as you just generously mentioned an interesting word, which is assimilation. So my question is structured as follows. If, sir, you are among the deciders during the Berlin Conference in 1884 up to 1885, do you agree with them to apply assimilation as the main goal was to change Africans? Thank you.
Gilbert, please, before you go away, and I plead my unexcusable ignorance here, but can you tell me what the Berlin Conference was? Because I'm not familiar with it.
Pardon?
I'm sorry?
Could you repeat it, the question, please?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. I'm not familiar with the Berlin Conference of 1884. Can you just remind or tell me, because I'm ignorant about that, what that was and how it relates to your question?
Okay, I relating the question because the assimilation has a really interest. This word assimilation, the first of all, during the Berlin Conference, the goal was to change Africans and to divide Africa. So that is why my question is structured as like this. If you are among them, do you agree to apply apply assimilation
To Africa?
In forms of changing Africans? Yes, thank you.
Can anyone help me with this? Does anyone know what the Berlin Conference was?
It was a conference of the colonial powers that divided up Africa.
Ah, okay. Thank you.
And also the Middle East, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So we're talking, and the gentleman speaking is an African man, correct?
I assume so, but I don't know.
I think we have to get be a little more specific, Roger, who is talking. Because this is the way I am feeling. This is Bill T. Jones. This is the first place, this essay, that I'm thinking that she really, and you know, I've said this at the beginning of this, when I started participating, that I wasn't sure. I came to Hannah Arendt to become a sharper political thinker. And now that we've gone off into something which is social psychological, which is being a Jew, I don't think that, and there's this thing that you're doing, Roger, which is the reason this is good for all of these groups that are dealing with neocolonialism and identity, is because her experience is so relevant, so universal. And there's something about the way words like assimilation, pariah, I feel I get more pushed further and further away because there's certain conversations we haven't had about. For instance, I don't believe there's ever been a common world. And to accept Hannah Arendt, you've got to understand and believe in a common world. And the whole way the 20th century came out, we're just now getting out, able to think that there is something called Black psychology. There is something called trans psychology. Trans people are not just another group of pariahs. They really offer a revolution to the whole world. We have to, and whose language is Hannah Arendt using? I know she has an axe to grind with her much beloved German Jewish heritage. She loves it, she hates it. That's not my heritage. But in a way, I get positioned into making it my heritage. They named me, they named her, they named you. Who is this they? So the gentleman is trying to get at a time when people did not have to hide. The colonial powers got together and said, the world is this way because we say it is, and therefore these people are going to be, and these because we say they are. Now we have this messy moment where people are saying, hold off, you cannot tell me who I am. And I don't want to be assimilated. Matter of fact, I even repent. And artists, for instance, right now, artists are saying they can define okay, I know she loves artists, but I don't think she understands artists, particularly contemporary artists and artists whose bodies are at the center of what they're doing. Because we're still dealing with people who have defined us, who were in the 19th century. And this boogaboo of the German Jewish heritage becomes a little bit hard to take right now, even as a lesson. And I think that's what you're trying to say. So I'm sorry I jumped in there, but Adolf, my brother, why don't you jump in there with me? Can you help this gentleman, this man, this Black man on the phone trying to speak? Here, this is a very important moment in this group. I don't think one size fits all. And I have great respect for the lady. I apologize for bullying my way into that.
No, I appreciate it because I asked for help. And thank you. That was helpful. I think so the Berlin conference, to the extent I understand it, as this colonial powers dividing of Africa and the Middle East, to what extent, I mean, I guess the question from Gilbert is something along the lines of to what extent Africa has had to or should have to or think about assimilating to a world order.
Wasn't that the expectation that we would do that?
Yeah, I think
if we help you clean up your prehistorical world, your primitive societies, if we gave you your hospitals and so on, then you would become more like us and you would become truly civilized.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, it's sort of what Arendt calls the parvenu or the pariah. So I think that's right. And I think it's a good question. And I think it's an important, another important aspect, on the question of whether reading Arendt is at all relevant today. I think what I tried to say at the beginning is that's a question. I think that's I think that there are some people today who have turned to her and thought she's very relevant, and some people today who are turning to her and say, no, these analogies don't work. Jewish psychology is not the same as Black psychology, is not the same as trans psychology, right? None of that is to say that she would insist that it is. I think reading her can either be helpful or not, depending on how one sees it. What else?
Roger, may I just one more thing, please?
Yeah.
Here, when I was reading, I think it was the Hannah, or maybe it was the Lazar. There's this idea that you can choose to be a pariah or parvenu. But I think a lot of the work, some of us, particularly Black middle-class artists, the work we have to do is realize your loneliness comes from the fact that you have not attended to, maybe that's what she means. For me to love my family is me to love me. It's like for someone saying, I want to be just an average Jew. Is that the same thing? When for me to have organized my whole life by the value systems of the white avant-garde, or the people writing at the New York Times or what have you, I never had people who did I turn to who had the same authority as those people. There's something I get confused in this about the parvenu and the pariah. So I guess I refuse to be a parvenu, and I refuse to be a pariah. So what does that make me, other than an oftentimes angry person? You know?
Well, I think that's what I think she would, I don't want to, I'm certainly not going to, it makes you Bill T. Jones.
Amen.
Amen. But, if you allow me to at least play with the analogy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's something like Heinrich Heine. I mean, it's someone who can both succeed as a German in this case, and as a Jew, and who's able to sing the Jewish song and also enjoy the freedom of being a German. That was, she said, a very rare thing that very few people could do. And, it can't really be a model for everybody, because she doesn't think most people are going to be able to do it. But, when it succeeds, it's a pretty extraordinary thing. The worry she has about the schlemiel type, and this is, I think, what Adolf was asking about, if I understood it correctly, and I was at least trying to answer it, is that to the extent you embrace the normalcy of family and are not able to also make it in the world of avant-garde white artists, you end up losing power and becoming worldless in some sense, and not being able to enjoy that political and other social freedom. And she sees that as a trade-off that's dangerous, and also harrowing for one's soul. So, I mean, look, she's talking about the Jewish experience here. She's not talking about anything else. I think a lot of people in other body types can find in what she's talking about something meaningful. Now, I think you're right that today there's a lot of other resources for this. There's other psychologists, there's Black psychologists, trans psychologists, all sorts of stuff. But in 1944, this was pretty radical stuff from a Jewish writer talking about this, and very critical about Jewish parvenus and Jewish elites who she thought were selling the rest of the Jews down the river. But yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to hold it out as, today everyone has to read Hannah Arendt and understand, their life as a Muslim or Black or Jew or whatever. But I do think she's framing, in a particular historical time, she's framing the question in a way that's quite meaningful. Is that, I mean, and maybe,
Well,
I mean,
Roger,
I guess
Roger, I'm a fan.
Yeah, but the question is it meaningful to you? I mean, I guess that's the question. If it's not, I understand that too.
It is meaningful to a point, but I find more and more as I've been reading these particular essays, because they are so particular, and I have such respect for the lady, I'm wondering sometimes, it's Bill, are you in the right conversation? You want to be in the human condition conversation. You want to be on thinking conversation. Maybe you want to be in the totalitarian, the origins of totalitarian. Maybe this is not the place, because what this is about is this is a person who is really angry. And she's angry for reasons that I recognize, but then again, her solutions, I don't know if she knows what it means, like to say, this whole thing with Baldwin is not satisfactory. What she missed there in the American civil rights struggle, what she missed. So, okay,
I agree with you. I agree.
fan. She's on my night table, and I read it every day. Well, let's put it that way, okay?
I agree with you about the Baldwin. You know, I think to me, the solution she's leading towards, right, is that we have to, as pariah peoples, resist the temptation to simply embrace our pariahdom, and we have to become political. We have to be willing to struggle and fight for our political rights and not be satisfied with our social freedom that we might be able to find in some crevices here and there. And that raises the question that you raised at the very beginning of your remarks of, is there a political world that can be a common world? Can there be a common world? She doesn't think the common world exists. She thinks the common world is something we have to fight for, and we have to build from the ground up. And what she's saying is, it's a temptation for all pariah peoples, all oppressed peoples, to find crevices of freedom, hovels of freedom, and say that's enough. And that's going to be a mistake. Look what happened in 1940, right? 1933 to 1944. That kind of embrace of acceptance of social discrimination at the expense of political freedom is going to lead to bad things. That's what she's saying. And so we have to be willing to fight for political equality and not accept being given scraps of exceptionalism. That's her argument. I think that's relevant today, but you know, everyone's going to have to read it in their own way.
Mm-hmm.
Roger, can I say something given that build? I think in terms of like assimilating into world projects, capitalist projects, supremacy projects, all those projects, I think it's very clear for many reasons. I think that yes, it's true. Folks are having to assimilate in all kinds of projects. I think that it's also important in those societies. Like I'm in Haiti right now, right? So given the society that I'm in, where it's very hard for someone to practice Vodou, which is African religion, publicly in some circles, right? So even in my own family, like to hear stuff about Vodou, folks will like turn the other way. So then I think that there are layers of pariahdom within these people, which I think is something that's really important to note. And then I think there are also other layers of pariahdom that are, like, for example, I have a really good friend who's Haitian. His grandfather was Abby Nathan, the Israeli activist, whose daughter Sharona married a Palestinian in Haiti. And he himself and his brother are now painters. And so we're talking about Israeli, Palestinian, Haitian. And I talk to him about this all the time, about the fact that, like, I feel ashamed that there are so many Haitians who don't consider him Haitian because obviously, you know what I mean? Like he's not, I mean, he doesn't look Haitian for them or something of the sort. So I think that there's that also. So I do agree with you, Bill, but I do think that as we're getting to the idea of a pariah, then really looking at it, if we're really going to do a global thing, then really tackling all kinds of aspects of like oppression, which is like the oppression of peoples, and then how oppressed peoples oppress people within their people. How I honestly think one of the ugliest things that I've ever seen is, as an organizer, seeing Black institutions oppress LGBTQ folks, which I think is often not spoken about, but I think is pretty disgusting, and all kinds of things, you know? So it is spoken about, but often it's pushed aside for politics. So I do think that, like, if we're going to have it's a pretty big discussion. Yeah.
I appreciate that. First of all, be safe in Haiti right now. Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that right now with both Kanye West and with Kyrie Irving in the United States issues. Okay, I'm gonna let some of the people come in, but this is great, and let's keep coming back to it. Who's next? Jeff.
Hi. Yeah, I'm really surprised at how much I've gotten into this book. I mean, we're 300 pages in now, which is apparently only a little over halfway. But I mean, I've been finding a lot of interest in this, and I'm not Jewish. I thought the Jewish writings, you know, that's going to be the Jewish people. But I was wrong. I really quite enjoyed this. The last week's essay was awesome. Unfortunately, I didn't make the meeting, but this one I think is even more. I've had this recurring idea that basically that I see things in here and says, oh, this is why she says the things that she does in her, let's call them the secular writings, whatever, right? That this is sort of what's powering her through this, because a lot of times she's hard to follow for a lot of people, right? It's like, well, where did this come from? What's this story here? And it's like, well, now it's written in blazing letters because of her origin, either as a Jew, usually, not so much as a woman, but other those things are everywhere. So, but I've never really been able to see. It's a sort of a general point that applies to everything. But now, finally, I have a question or rather an example to go with here. I'm looking at the bottom of page 284, the paragraph that runs over, where it's got Lazar's idea was therefore that a Jew should come out openly as a representative of the pariah, since it is a duty of every human being to resist oppression. He demanded that the pariah relinquish the prerogative of the shlemiel. And you go on with this, and then it's like, this is a story of the parable of the cave. Maybe we should just go through it, but you know, this idea that whereas the sky is essentially the world of fancy and illusion, and the cave is the world of men and women. So I mean, so when she mentions that in I think it's the Socrates essay back in
Yeah.
they're right, and then also in thinking, and she talks about it quite a bit. That basically, this is why she's picking this out, and so it gives, and this is sort of what Bill was alluding to, that it gives a little emotional impact. This is why she's angry enough to write about this, you know. And to me, that's very clarifying for how this fits together. I mean, I think the risk of it, and maybe this is where the question is if assuming you agree with what I said so far. The risk of it is that it sort of, then it makes it seem like it's particular to her, you know, or to Jews, you know. And so that what happens in say the human condition is that it's taken, you know, in an intellectual sort of way, and she tries to make the argument from things that are, you know, available to everybody, but they're not always all that important to everybody. So I'm interested in particularly, you know, assuming that you agree with the gist of what I'm saying, what is the take that we should have? Did it work for her, or you know, now when we think of how to promote these ideas now, what do we do?
It's a great question, Jeff. Thank you. So yeah, I mean, this, you know, in my passage, in my book, on these pages that those lines you just cited, I say, you know, see the essay on refugees, right? Which was the essay we read for last week, where at the very end of that essay, she calls and says that the refugees, for those few refugees who can, they have to come out as refugees on the political sphere and become the avant-garde, not only of refugees, but of a new kind of people, right? I think in the same way, Jews have to come out of being a pariah people and shlemiels and come out openly as representatives of the pariahs, as Jews, and engage in politics as Jewish politics, not as American politics or German politics. In the same way, Muslim politics, feminist politics, Black politics, trans politics. The point is, like, Arendt's not an identitarian thinker, right? But she is someone who believes that you have to enter the political world not as an abstract citizen, but as an embodied historical figure. And you have to do that in order to build a world that allows all sorts of different plural individuals, because politics is about plurality, to live in common, right? That's, Bill said there is no common world. Well, she thinks you have to make it. How do you make it? You make it by talking to each other as who we are and not denying it and not requiring of other people that they deny who they are. That's the power of her politics, as I understand it. George.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. I'm just going to go back to the old topic, to the other topic. Again, as I said last week, in any other country other than Germany, Heine would be not considered a pariah. He would be considered an acculturated Jew. This is someone who practices his religion, his or her religion, who also participates in society. Now, something like this was in 20th century America, late 20th century America, and this goes to Bill's point. The thing is that Jews did not consider themselves pariah in 20th century America because they were able to function in most ways, including even politically, which gave rise to the neocon movement. It's different now. It's different now, and we are right back to the situation. It has to do with the political situation in a given country. If you're given the opportunities, then you're fine. Once it's being taken away again, and this is back to the back circular stuff, we're back to the pariah standpoint.
Yeah.
So
George,
the thing is, it's really, Hannah Arendt is not a spokesman for current American Jews. It's because we're back to the pariah standpoint, and people don't want to discuss this because the thing is, we had it good in the mid and late 20th century.
okay.
And we could then, so it's a different situation. So really, Arendt is not the one that becomes a target for other press groups.
Thank you. So first of all, I would never want to say Arendt is a spokesman for anyone, let alone Jews. And I certainly don't think of myself as a spokesman for Arendt. So, I'm doing the best I can to bring her alive for us in a meaningful way. And, you make of it what you can. On your comment about Heine, I just want to remind you all, he was baptized. I mean, I don't know what that means as an acculturated Jew. But he was willing to go through a baptism in order to get certain privileges. If that's, I don't know, acculturated versus assimilated. I mean, I think I hear the distinctions you're trying to make, and I think that they're worth talking about. I take it to be that an acculturated Jew is someone who, doesn't fully assimilate and holds on to some aspects of their culture. Whether Heine was that after a baptism or not is an interesting question, but let's say he was. Even so, I think an acculturated Jew, as you're understanding it, if I understand it correctly, has the same tensions in them that that Arendt is talking about in the question between pariah and parvenu. Whether the late 20th century was the golden age for American Jewry, I'm going to not touch. I think many people would say it was an age in which Jews assimilated maybe too much under a false hope that they could become Americans. And what they're finding now is that didn't work out so well. And that may be what you mean by the return of the pariah.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean. I happen to be a refugee from World War II Europe, and I've noticed that all along throughout my entire life in America, and worried about, hey, it's got to go back to what it used to be, because that's what happens, and it happens again.
Yeah.
Nietzsche was right about eternal return.
All right, good. Thank you, George. Jerry, good to see you. Yeah, you got to unmute, Jerry.
Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Very interesting today, Roger, I think. And what I would hope to do is give a little footnote to what Mr. Jones said and other people joined in. We haven't talked much about Charlie Chaplin, and he does stand out in this group. And the suspect and the trickster, very much because of this article, which was quite widely read when it was published first, Chaplin made a very large announcement that he was not a Jew. And he said that he grew up as a London Cockney, but he wasn't Jewish. Now, nobody knows quite what the truth is about that, but it's interesting. Chaplin did not deny anything that she says about him in this, except that he was not a Jew. And that, I think, is interesting in regard to how applicable this essay is to other people than from Jews, that is. The other main thing I want to say is that Arendt in 1943, when the Refugees was written in 1944, when this essay was written, the Hidden Tradition, Arendt knew then, which she had not known before, not known, she'd heard about it and she couldn't believe it, neither could her husband, that the Jewish life in Europe, which he is such a chronicler of, is finished. It's over. It was destroyed. It was being destroyed before her eyes. She never thought otherwise. In other words, this is sort of the opposite of the point I'm trying to make with Chaplin. She is, I think, here denying that that is not why she's talking about the Jewish pariah or we refugees. She's not talking about that as anyone's situation today. This is finished for her. The Jewish pariah is a great essay, I believe, as it shows the disintegration just before the disappearance of a people of which she herself was a part. Doesn't mean they all died. It means that the life as a European Jew ended. It's not to be revived either. And what she says very, very explicitly, elsewhere to be sure, is that what is important, what matters about this is to show what happened and not what is going to happen, but what potentially can happen. And that is what you want to, I think, the idea of seeing this from another point of view, God knows not from the point of view of identity politics, which she thought was simply a contradiction in terms, but as someone put up a notice here, but as what this world is capable of, what men are capable of doing to other people. We are not in that situation today. Blacks or Asians or whatever, they're not being destroyed in the way the Jews, European Jews, it's an entity for her, was destroyed. And that I think is good to bear in mind, that you want to see the problems, as she puts it, you want to see the problems that led to that, not that we are in that situation, but that we want to be able to understand the situation we are in and what is potential in that situation. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Jerry. I think those are both really important points. The second point, especially, I want to just gloss on in this way, which is, as you said, it's showing what this world is capable of, and it's showing what can allow this to happen. And I don't know if you were on earlier when I was talking, but one of the things that I find interesting in this essay in 1944 versus the way it's taken up in chapter 3 of Origins is that in this essay, she ends the Kafka section saying that social discrimination, social pariahdom, paves the way for senseless suffering of an entire people on page 296. Whereas in Origins, written 6 years later, or published 6 years later, she makes, I think, a stronger differentiation between the danger of political oppression and discrimination and the, uncomfort but in a sense, dualness of social discrimination. And I think what you're referring to is that she says that political discrimination is not nearly is dangerous, whereas social discrimination is sometimes bad but not dangerous. And I take that to be, if I'm not mistaken, I take that to be somewhat of the point you're making, that we should understand that social discrimination is something we need to address, and that can be, and it is, but it can lead to, and can, if we're not careful and if we don't respond to it in important ways, can lead to the kind of political discrimination and political oppression that then could lead to what happened in the 1930s and 40s. Is that?
Well, I think that's very, very, very true what you're saying, Roger. The point is, for me anyway, is that how these things are connected or can be connected. So I say, you're right. We have social discrimination in her terms rather than political discrimination. I mean, if you listen to the Washington, the crap that comes out of there, you see there's no political discrimination whatsoever. But there is plenty of social discrimination, and there seems to be a movement afoot in this country to want to make that social discrimination into political discrimination. That's what I think she wants to draw one's attention to, that is possible, what that would mean. It's a huge change.
It is. I think that's exactly right. And I think to come back to the question Bill asked about the relevance, right? Which, again, whether the psychology is relevant, I don't know. I think what is relevant, at least as a thought provocation in these essays, is precisely to think deeply about the paths of connection and also the paths of differentiation between social and political discrimination. Because you're always going to have some social discrimination in any society. And the question is, to what extent, how one responds to that, and where the danger is that it becomes political. I think that's very helpful. And to me, that's what's really, and how to respond to social discrimination, which in her mind can either be through becoming a pariah and embracing it, and embracing that culture and finding a kind of freedom in being outsiders, And that's a temptation, and it's there. But what she's warning you in 1944 is, if you do that too much, the chances are that it will become political discrimination. And that's to me the relevant point. Thanks, Jerry. Is that good? Yeah.
Yes, I like this essay very much as well, and for different reasons, actually. So I just point to some of them, since I don't regard myself as a pariah. I've been a citizen, and I don't been oppressed in some ways. But I think there's some other things that stick out to me. For instance, when Hannah says, a man is born free and he can lose his freedom only by selling himself into bondage. Of course, there's different levels of how much freedom there is people are born with. But it is something that I think it's important to think about today. For so many people put themselves into bondages by following society, but just going into it, striving for materialist, striving for getting up in society. So that was something that struck out to me. And also this with embracing what the earth gives with the sun and so, and everything that is equal for everyone. And that reminds me of the preface of Human Condition, where Arendt talks about the earth, actually, where how we should appreciate the earth we live on, this planet, among in a universe that's so cold and so without living conditions for any living organisms. So we better not forget that. And when it came to Lazare, I thought of this, especially when he says, since it is the duty of every human being to resist oppression, I think also we that are not suppressed may support in many ways the oppressed people. We should support them when they do the fight themselves. We shouldn't start a fight for them because they have to decide for themselves. Like in Iran, when a woman is going out, have been this woman who was killed by the moral police, but now she's getting a lot of support from different corners of the world. And to Charlie Chaplin, I thought, though, there I think Arendt starts with this kind of criticism of bureaucracy. At least in my mind, she does that in a way, because she points to this when you have kind of being this suspect and you're attacked all the time, and then you have a law, but you don't have individuals. So the individuals are not seen. You are just attacked according to a law, and a law that's not interpreted is very dangerous. And then in the end, with this Kafka thing, when you just to start thinking, and the importance to use thinking, as Arendt is so much into. And the last comment, I wonder, that's also a question, when you say the difference between the social and the political, to me it seems like this is something that's happening in the US today with this gerrymandering, and also the other kind of or hinders or something that are done to make some people not be able to vote. So would you say that is when some social oppression goes over to political oppression? That was, yeah.
Thanks, Vigdis. Yeah, there's a ton in everything you've asked. So I'll just say two things. One, where's the line you quoted, a man is born free and he can lose his freedom only by selling himself into bondage. She continues, in line with this idea, both in his political poems and his prose writings, Hannah vents his anger not only on tyrants, but equally on those who put up with them. And I think that actually goes to some of Adolf's points earlier about, the way people align themselves with tyrannical views, even if they're not tyrants. And I think that's right on. On the question of social and political, I think this is one of the most important questions, and it's a hugely important question in Arendt's writing, but also today. Where are we seeing the move from social to political oppression, as Jerry put it? Certainly around questions of refugees and immigrants, right? There is a palpable loss of rights that are being felt by people coming into this country as immigrants or refugees. The intimidation, you have these people running around taking pictures of people putting ballots in voting booths in voting boxes, or asking them questions and stuff like this. This is clearly an attempt to intimidate some people who might think, oh, I don't want to be on camera, or I don't want to be asked, or whatever. These are clearly, to the extent these are legalized things, or that you're not allowed to give water to people online to vote, or that there are limits on how many voting booths there are in certain areas. These are clearly attempts to, limit voting. Now, I will say that if you actually look at these are not usually done based on religion or race. They're usually done based on who votes Republican or who votes Democrat. Now, what's important is that religion and race and income and other things can be a proxy for who votes Republican and Democrat, and therefore we run into that problem. But I mean, if you go back to the United States boss tweet era and others, I mean, we've tried to limit who can vote and encourage who can vote based on all sorts of criteria for hundreds of years in this country, and it's not a pretty sight. It's called power politics, and I think that what we're seeing right now is, Arendt talks about in the Chaplin essay, at the end of the Chaplin essay, the rise of Superman, which is another way of saying power politics. And clearly we are seeing an unadulterated rise of power politics today. It has overlaps into race and religion and other things as well. But there are plenty of places, what you can and can't teach in school around race or transgender ideologies and things of that. The limit, you're right, the limitation of vote based on gerrymandering and other things. These are the places that I think Arendt would say, look, the social discrimination you should argue with, you should worry about, you should discuss, but it's when it starts to bleed into these kind of questions, that's when you need to really be alert, as I understand her. I can't see the screen. We're at time. I see there's still some questions. Can we wait till next time? Because we're already past our time, and I like to keep us fairly on time. So a reminder, we are not meeting next week on the 11th. The next meeting of the group will be on the 18th. And look forward to seeing you then. And enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and have a great 2 weeks. See you soon.